The rugged canyons of Arizona Territory stretched endless under the burning sun. In 1882, a man could disappear into those red rocks and never be found. For Ethan Walker, a lone rancher living on the edge of Apache lands, that isolation was exactly what he wanted. But saving the Apache chief's daughter from certain death would change everything. The ancient law said she now belonged to him forever. The problem was, the most dangerous man in the territory had already claimed her for himself, and he'd burn every ranch and village to get her back. Ethan Walker wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble. He'd come to this harsh land 3 years ago, buying a small ranch where the grasslands met the canyon country. His nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and that suited him fine. Every morning he'd ride his property line, checking for broken fences and watching his small herd of cattle. The Apache who lived in the nearby mountains left him alone, and he returned the favor. It was a simple life, and after what he'd seen in the war, simple was all he wanted. But in the Arizona Territory of 1882, peace never lasted long. The real power in the region belonged to Samuel Barlow, a man who owned more land than some eastern states. Barlow had built his empire on fear and violence, taking what he wanted and destroying anyone who stood in his way. His ranch sprawled across the best water sources, and his hired guns made sure no one challenged his control. The Apache called him the Shadow Man because death followed wherever he went. The trouble started on a hot June morning when Ethan was riding the southern edge of his property. The canyons here were a maze of red rock and hidden paths, dangerous for anyone who didn't know them well. Ethan had learned these trails from an old prospector, and he used them to move his cattle to fresh grass without crossing Barlow's land. But today, something was wrong. He could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls, harsh and angry. Moving carefully through the rocks, Ethan found a sight that made his blood run cold. 3 of Barlow's men had cornered a young Apache woman on a narrow ledge. Her horse lay dead at the bottom of the ravine, and she stood with her back to a 100-foot drop. The men were laughing, moving closer, cutting off any escape. One of them held a rope like he was planning to catch a wild animal. Ethan didn't think, he just acted. His first shot knocked the rope from the man's hands. His second sent another man's gun spinning into the ravine. The third man turned to fire back, but Ethan was already moving, using the rocks for cover. Years of fighting had taught him how to use terrain, and these canyons were his territory. He worked his way behind the attackers, forcing them to retreat step by step. The fight was short but vicious. One of Barlow's men got lucky, grazing Ethan's shoulder with a bullet that burned like fire. But Ethan kept pushing forward, and soon the 3 men were running for their horses, shouting threats as they fled. Ethan knew they'd be back with more men, but for now the woman was safe. She stood on the ledge, watching him with dark eyes that showed no fear. Her dress was torn from climbing, and her hands were bloody from gripping the rocks, but she held herself like royalty. When Ethan approached slowly, showing his empty hands, she spoke in clear English. "You are the rancher who lives alone by the old spring. Name's Ethan Walker," he said, pressing his bandana against his bleeding shoulder. "You're hurt. Let me help." "I am Naya," she said, then added quietly, "daughter of Chief Tohana." Ethan's heart sank. Everyone knew Chief Tohana led the strongest Apache band in the region. Barlow had been trying to drive them from their mountain stronghold for years, wanting their land for his cattle. If Barlow's men had taken or killed the chief's daughter, it would have started a war that would consume the entire territory. "Can you walk?" Ethan asked. "Your village isn't far if we cut through the canyon." Naya nodded, but when she tried to step forward, her ankle gave out. She'd twisted it badly in the chase. Without asking permission, Ethan lifted her onto his horse, then led the animal carefully through the winding paths. The journey took 2 hours under the harsh sun, with Ethan's shoulder throbbing and Naya directing him through trails he'd never seen before. The Apache village appeared suddenly as they rounded a massive red boulder. One moment they were alone in the wilderness, the next they were surrounded by warriors with drawn bows. Ethan kept his hands visible and moved slowly, knowing one wrong move would mean death. But Naya spoke quickly in Apache, and the weapons lowered slightly. Chief Tohana emerged from the largest dwelling, a man whose presence commanded instant respect. His face was weathered like the canyon walls, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much war. When he saw his daughter, relief flickered across his stern features before hardening into rage at her condition. Naya told the story in both Apache and English, making sure everyone understood what had happened. The chief's face grew darker with each word, especially when she described how Barlow's men had chased her to the cliff edge. When she finished, the chief turned to Ethan, studying the white man who had risked his life for an Apache woman. "You are bleeding," the chief said in English. "Our medicine woman will treat your wound." It wasn't a request. Two warriors helped Ethan to a dwelling where an elderly woman cleaned and bandaged his shoulder with surprising gentleness. The herbs she used numbed the pain better than any whiskey could have. As she worked, Ethan could hear raised voices outside, the village discussing what had happened in Rapid Apache. When the medicine woman finished, Chief Tohana entered alone. He sat across from Ethan, his face unreadable. "You saved my daughter from death," he said slowly. "This creates a debt that must be addressed." "No debt," Ethan said quickly. "Any decent man would have done the same." The chief shook his head. "You do not understand. By our sacred law, when someone saves another from certain death, the saved one's life belongs to the savior. This law has existed since before my grandfather's grandfather. It cannot be ignored." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Chief Tohana, I respect your ways, but I don't believe in owning another person. I can't accept this." The chief's eyes flashed with anger. "You reject our law. You insult our traditions." "No," Ethan said carefully. "I mean no disrespect, but where I come from, people choose their own paths. I won't take that choice from your daughter." The tension in the dwelling grew thick as smoke. Finally the chief stood. "You will remain here as our guest until the spirits show us the proper path. This is not a request, Ethan Walker. You invoked the sacred law when you saved her. Now you must face its consequences." Two warriors positioned themselves outside the dwelling, making it clear that Ethan was indeed a guest who couldn't leave. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls gold and crimson, Ethan realized he'd traded one kind of trouble for another. He'd saved a life, but now he was trapped by laws he didn't understand. The next morning, Naya came to see him. She moved carefully on her injured ankle, bringing food and water. "You confuse my father," she said, sitting near the entrance. "No one has ever refused the law before." "I meant no offense," Ethan said, "but I've seen what happens when people think they own other people. It's wrong." Naya studied him with those intelligent eyes. "You fought in the war between the blue and gray." "It wasn't a question." Ethan nodded. "I did things I'm not proud of, saw things that changed me. That's why I came here, to get away from all that." "Yet you fought for me," she said. "A stranger, an Apache. You were in trouble, that's all that mattered." They talked through the morning, and Ethan found himself surprised by her education. Naya had learned English from missionaries and could read and write better than most people he knew. She told him about her people's struggles, how Barlow and men like him kept pushing them from their lands, poisoning water sources and killing game to starve them out. "My father wants peace," she said, "but Barlow wants war. He believes we're animals to be removed." Over the following days, Ethan and Naya spent more time together. She showed him how her people lived, their deep connection to the land that Barlow saw only as property to own. He told her about the world beyond the territory, about cities with buildings that touched the sky and trains that could cross the country in days. They were from different worlds, but they found common ground in their love of the land and their desire for peace. Meanwhile, 50 miles away in the town of Mineral Springs, Barlow was spreading his poison. He stood in the saloon, buying drinks and telling anyone who'd listen that Ethan Walker had betrayed his own kind. "He's thrown in with the Apache," Barlow declared, "probably telling them all our weaknesses, helping them plan raids on honest folk." The townspeople, already fearful of the Apache and dependent on Barlow for protection, began to believe the lies. Barlow knew exactly what he was doing. He needed justification for what came next, and painting Ethan as a traitor gave him the excuse he needed. He began gathering his men, over 30 hired guns, who cared only for gold and blood. Back in the Apache village, Ethan noticed the increasing tension. Scouts reported large groups of armed men gathering at Barlow's ranch. The chief doubled the guards and moved the women and children to hidden camps deeper in the mountains. War was coming, and everyone knew it. On the 7th night of Ethan's stay, Naya found him sitting alone, watching the stars. "My father will release you tomorrow," she said. "He believes keeping you here will only bring more trouble." "And the law?" Ethan asked. "Still stands. By tradition, I belong to you whether you accept it or not." She sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair. "But I think you already know that laws and traditions cannot chain a person's spirit. You should be free to choose your own life," Ethan said. "Choice," Naya said softly. "Such a simple word, yet my people have had so few choices. Barlow chooses to take our land. The government chooses to ignore our treaties. Even nature seems to choose against us with drought and disease. You have a choice now," Ethan said. "Whatever happens, I won't let anyone force you into anything." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You are a strange man, Ethan Walker. You fight for people who aren't your own, refuse honors that others would kill for, and speak of choice to someone who has never truly had one." Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the village perimeter. Scouts ran in with urgent news. Barlow was coming with a small army, and they'd be here by dawn. The chief gathered his warriors, barely 40 men against Barlow's superior numbers and weapons. It would be a massacre unless they could find an advantage. Ethan stood in the council, an outsider but one who'd earned respect. "Barlow expects you to fight like warriors," he said. "But this isn't about honor, it's about survival. Let me show you how we fought in the war when we were outnumbered." Through the night, Ethan worked with the Apache warriors, setting up defensive positions using the natural terrain. He showed them how to create crossfire zones, how to use the canyon walls to ricochet bullets, how to make one man seem like three. The Apache were quick learners, combining his military tactics with their intimate knowledge of the land. As the first light touched the canyon walls, Barlow's force appeared. They came in hard and fast, expecting to overwhelm the village with sheer numbers, but Ethan had anticipated this. The first wave hit preset defensive positions and crumbled under coordinated fire. Barlow's men, used to fighting scattered resistance, found themselves facing disciplined defenders who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Ethan fought beside the Apache warriors, his rifle singing its deadly song. Beside him, Naya worked to reload weapons and tend wounds, brave as any warrior. When a group of Barlow's men tried to flank their position, she was the one who spotted them and warned the defenders in time. The battle raged through the morning, with Barlow growing increasingly desperate. He'd expected an easy victory, not this fierce resistance. His men began to waver, especially the townspeople he'd convinced to join him. They'd come expecting to fight savages, and found instead a coordinated defense that picked them apart. Finally, Barlow himself pushed forward, determined to end this personally. He spotted Ethan and charged, firing wildly. Ethan dove behind a boulder, feeling bullets chip the stone inches from his head. This was it, the final confrontation that would decide everything. The two men stalked each other through the rocks, each seeking advantage. Barlow had fury and desperation on his side, but Ethan had something more powerful, fighting for something beyond himself, for people who'd become important to him, for a woman who'd shown him that courage comes in many forms. The end came suddenly. Barlow, in his rage, exposed himself for just a moment too long. Ethan's shot was clean and final, dropping the land baron in the dust he'd spilled so much blood to control. With their leader dead, Barlow's remaining men fled, the townspeople fastest of all, finally seeing how they'd been used. As the dust settled and the canyon returned to quiet, Chief Tohana approached Ethan. The chief's arm was bloodied, but his eyes were clear. "You fought as one of us," he said. "You bled for our people when you could have run." "It was the right thing to do," Ethan said simply. The chief nodded slowly. "I understand now. You refused the sacred law not from disrespect, but from a different kind of honor. A man who sees people as free souls cannot accept owning another, even when tradition demands it." He raised his voice so all could hear. "The sacred law is fulfilled. My daughter's life was saved, and that debt has been repaid in blood and courage. She is free to choose her path." All eyes turned to Naya. She stood tall despite her exhaustion, looking first at her father, then at the gathered tribe, and finally at Ethan. "The old law said I belonged to this man," she said clearly. "Today that law is ended, but I choose to bind myself with a different law, the law of the heart. I choose to stand with Ethan Walker, not because tradition demands it, but because my spirit calls to his." She walked to Ethan and took his hand. "If you'll have me, not as property but as a partner, I would build a bridge between our peoples. Together we can show that Apache and White can live as neighbors, maybe even as family." Ethan felt something break loose in his chest, a weight he'd carried since the war. "I came here to be alone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you've shown me that some things are worth fighting for, worth joining with others for. Yes, Naya, let's build that bridge together." The chief stepped forward and placed his hands on both their shoulders. "This is a new path, one our ancestors could not have imagined. But perhaps it is the path that will save our people, not through war but through understanding." As the sun climbed higher into the sky, painting the canyon walls with light, Ethan and Naya stood together. They faced an uncertain future in a land still torn by conflict and misunderstanding. There would be those on both sides who'd condemn their choice, who'd see their union as betrayal rather than hope. But they'd already faced the worst that hatred could bring, and survived it together. The ranch that Ethan had built for solitude would become something different now, a place where two worlds could meet and learn from each other. Naya would teach him the old ways of reading the land, of finding medicine in plants, and wisdom in the turning of seasons. He would share his knowledge of the changing world beyond the territory, of laws and letters that might protect her people better than arrows ever could. Some of the Apache warriors helped Ethan rebuild his ranch house, adding traditional touches that would make Naya feel at home. Some of the townspeople, shamed by how easily they'd been led to violence, came to apologize and offer support. Not everyone accepted this new arrangement, but enough did to give them hope. Their story spread across the territory, carried by traders and travelers. The white rancher who'd fought beside the Apache, the chief's daughter who'd chosen her own path, the sacred law that had been transformed by a different kind of honor. Some called it scandal, others called it prophecy, but all agreed it was something new in a land that desperately needed change. Standing on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Ethan and Naya knew the challenges ahead would be real. But they also knew that every choice to reach across division, every act of courage in the face of fear, every bridge built between peoples, these were the things that would truly tame the wild frontier. Not with violence and conquest, but with understanding and respect. Their love had begun with an act of salvation and a law neither of them wanted, but it had transformed into something stronger, a choice made freely by two people who saw beyond the boundaries others had drawn. In a land where taking was the way of power, they had chosen giving. Where division was expected, they had chosen unity. The Old West was changing, one choice at a time, one bridge at a time, one love at a time. And for Ethan and Naya, that change began with them.